can labor address issues that it has with capitalism without participating in capitalism?
Probably not, in my view. I think that this is an echo of the same kind of argument that we heard in prior decades about, don't get engaged in electoral politics. Or, you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s when unions were a lot more powerful than they were today. They were critical, absolutely critical. They're still important today, but not like they were back then. They were a critical part of, say, the Democratic Party power structure. And on the one hand, one can point to examples of how, as becoming part of that structure, they may have, from time to time, lost touch with their roots and what they should have been doing. I think that is a risk. On the other hand, I think most of us would agree that working people in this country were better off when unions were strong and powerful and had to be dealt with. And yes, the power structure had to come to them for help in getting elected and for sources of funding and so on and so forth. I think we're in a sort of similar situation now with capital markets in the 21st century. I think we all know how powerful these entities are. We know that capital sloshes around the globe very quickly. And what I try to do is provide examples in the book of how some activists, by no means all, but how some have figured out ways to use their own capital to advance the ball. So let me give you an example. Okay, New York City has significant pension funds, $190 billion in assets. They recently adopted a responsible contractor policy, which basically says when we make investments in infrastructure, or if we make investments in real estate, you're going to hire, anybody who invests with has got to hire union workers, pay fair wages, pay benefits, or we're not going to invest, period. Now, for too long, many pension funds have just gone ahead and made these investments anyway without caring about the worker side of the story. So New York City comes out and does this. And now, well, what happens subsequently? Suddenly Blackstone, which has $100 billion pulling together an infrastructure investment plan, says, you know what, fine, we want the capital, we're going to adopt the policy ourselves, right? That's the kind, we are seeing this happen in cities like Cleveland. I just spoke to a union leader who was doing this in Cleveland, Ohio, where the example there was that there is a well-known builder in Cleveland that doesn't use union labor, doesn't pay fair wages and benefits, and that person's been doing a lot of building in Cleveland. Well, finally, some of the unions got to, basically said, look, we're not going to invest in projects like this. We are not going to invest in your project if you're not going to hire union labor. Well, guess what? They suddenly did a 180 because they needed that capital. That's an example of how, if you're thinking creatively, that capital can be used to make good investments, yes, that pay off for retirement benefits down the road, but that actually put workers back to work, getting good wages, paying into their pension funds. It does have the potential to create a virtuous circle using unions' own money, using workers' own money. And I think, is that the solution to all of labor's problems? No, but I think we've got to be thinking more along these lines if we're going to turn around some of these trend lines.
A few weeks ago, a couple months ago, actually, we were talking to Mary Bottari and talking about the Supreme Court, the Janus case, and she was telling us how many of these public pension funds actually invest in things that work out to be anti-worker. How much of the problem isn't that the pension funds aren't being activists when it comes to being shareholder activists, but they're actually supporting the kind of policies that undermine their own workers? How much is that the issue?
Absolutely. I think that is an issue, and I think that's part of what some of the struggle is. Some of these pension funds have been captured. Let me give you an example. 2004, the teachers' unions in Florida were fighting against the reelection of Jeb Bush as governor. Okay, they're pushing against him being reelected. He is, in fact, reelected. Shortly thereafter, what happens? There's a big investment by Florida's pension funds in a company called Edison Schools. What does Edison Schools do? Edison Schools basically privatizes public school services, okay? Half of that money, by the way, that went into that is basically teacher pension money. So there you have an example of how teachers' own pensions in that state were used to fund a company that directly undermines the interests of the people who contribute to it. I talked to another guy, a custodian in Massachusetts, whose pension was invested in Aramark. This is a guy who'd worked there for 20 years. He'd been making $20 an hour, and then Aramark, after his retirement fund is invested in it, turns around, underbids his union for the contract, and offers him his own job back for $8.50 an hour. So those are the worst examples, Chuck. That is exactly how everything could go wrong. However, the answer to that isn't just to say, oh, throw up your hands, it's all a disaster, this is never going to work, because the example I just gave of New York City, there are a whole bunch of activists inside labor, inside the pension funds, who are waking up to these realities and are turning the story around, right? Because just in the same way that these private equity funds and others want this to get their hands on this capital, okay, that therefore makes it a source of power. Just like labor's labor, right? We're talking about labor's capital. Labor's labor. Why is labor's labor the fact that it actually, right, the working power provided by working people? Why is it valuable? Why in the past has labor, not as much as it used to be able to, but why in the past was labor able to use that power to get concessions from management? It's very simple, because management needed those workers to build their products. It's the same thing today with labor's capital. Management needs that capital to build these products. And so just as labor organized itself as labor, so too it should organize itself in terms of the significant pension funds that it has. And I provide many examples in the book of exactly how this has happened. And by the way, yes, that could be a danger, but it also is an opportunity. And I think people who recognize it as an opportunity have been able to turn the tide. And by the way, I should point out that we're not just talking about those kinds of issues. I mean, these pension funds have been at the forefront of going after runaway CEO pay, of going after essentially rigged corporate elections, and also of lobbying in D.C. for registration of private equity funds and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done with this power. And in my view, in the 21st century, if you're not in this game, everything will be decided against you anyway.
The pension funds that you say should be employed in this kind of shareholder activism, those are the same pension funds that we're being told within the media on a nightly basis are in crisis. You write, quote, explore the well-funded and forceful backlash against labor's capital. In particular, the Koch brothers political advocacy group, Americans for Prosperity, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, among others, are funding pension reform efforts that are ostensibly aimed at solving any alleged pension crisis, one whose existence is debatable. How is the pension crisis debatable? Because I've certainly not heard any debate. All I've heard is it is inevitable because we simply don't have the money required to pay out pensions.
So first of all, it's definitely debatable. You can find there are credible economists, credible actuaries on both sides of this debate. Yes, it's true there are those who say that disaster is on the way, and there are those who say it's not true, that the funds are basically sound. There are some, unquestionably, there's a difference between a national crisis, which is what we're being told is the situation, and the potential for certain cities and counties and certain places to be in trouble. Yes, there are certain places that are in trouble. There are other places that are exceptionally strong. New York State is like 90% funded. Wisconsin, 90%. There are many places that are quite strong. And really, the bottom line on this debate turns on a known unknown, to use that old famous phrase from Donald Rumsfeld, right? The known unknown, which is what's the future performance of markets? If markets perform in the next 50 years the way they've performed in the last 50 to 100, then there's no crisis. They're fine. The real question is what happens if they significantly underperform? But here's my main point, Chuck. What I worry about is that the whole conversation that is being had about public pension fund underfunding crisis and so on and so forth is really being used as a pretext to dismantle these funds, to take them apart, and to strip them of all their power by converting them all into a bunch of individually managed 401k accounts. That's what I really worry. So let's assume the worst, okay? Let's assume that these public pension funds are underfunded. Let's take the Koch brothers line on this and just assume that disaster is headed our way. There are many potential solutions, okay? And the worst of them is the one that seems to be getting the most advocacy, which is break all these things up into individually managed 401ks. What do I worry about? All we hear about is the underfunding problem, right? And how much do we owe workers, and what are we going to pay them? But I think there's another side to this whole story that we don't hear about, which is that these same funds are the future of labor's shareholder activism. They have been doing it the last 15 years. They've been doing it with increasingly greater success, okay? And the critical feature that enables them to be activist is that they are large, pooled sources of capital. CalPERS has $350 billion in assets. CalSTRS, which is the California State Teachers Fund, has $2.25 billion. New York City, $190 billion, right? You know, when David Weber, with his individual, 401k, and yes, anybody who has one of those is still relatively lucky, but even me by myself, nobody cares if I adopt a responsible contractor policy or if I think the CEO is overpaid or whatever. Nobody cares. I'm just an individual, far too small to matter. But when a CalPERS or a CalSTRS or a New York City funds shows up and they can file shareholder proposals and they can vote against the CEO's pay and they can bring lawsuits, right? Suddenly everybody pays far more attention. I don't think that's so. You take these big pension funds now, and in the name of so-called underfunding, break them up into millions of individually managed accounts. Essentially, I call this economic voter suppression. To me, it's no different than what has happened to labor itself. A pension is like a union, and a 401k is like right to work. We all know if you have a job and you're not part of a union, and you go to your boss and you say, I don't like my working conditions and I want more pay. The boss says, there's the door, see you later, right? But if you're part of a union and can speak with collective voice, you have much more power. The exact same thing is true with these retirement accounts. If you're an individual investor, nobody cares what you have to say. But if you're part of a huge pension fund, suddenly people pay attention. So what I worry is that this whole underfunding story is being used to break up these pension funds. And frankly, this comes back to stuff we were talking about earlier, because you raise fair points about how these pension funds have sometimes been used against the interests of workers. You raise fair points about the dangers of engaging in capitalism and the capital markets in that way. However, I also worry that some people on the left do not appreciate the fact that these pension funds, with their large, pooled, collective sources of capital, are really a potential source in the 21st century for real power. And I show in the book how it's a source of real power. And it's important to preserve them. And what I worry is people just think, they're invested in the markets, they're too compromised, forget it. The left isn't going to protect them. Meanwhile, there is a massively well-funded campaign to attack these pensions and break them up. And I think just as the left has tried to mobilize and rally to protect workers and unions and so on and so forth, these pension funds have to be the next battlefront, because if they get broken up into millions of little shards that are meaningless and have no power, then I think it'll just be even worse for workers who will see even less voice in the 21st century than they already have right now.